الصلاة والسلام. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك وأتوجه إليك بنبيك نبي الرحمة محمد صلى الله عليه وآله. يا أبا القاسم يا رسول الله، يا إمام الرحمة يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا. يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا الحسن، يا أمير المؤمنين، يا علي بن أبي طالب، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا. يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا فاطمة الزهراء، يا بنت محمد، يا قرة عين الرسول، يا سيدتنا ومولاتنا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا. يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا محمد، يا حسن بن علي، أيها المجتبى يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا. يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا عبد الله، يا حسين بن علي، أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا. يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا الحسين، يا علي بن الحسن حسين، أي يا زين العابدين يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا. يا وجيها عند الله، اشفع لنا عند الله. يا أبا جعفر، يا محمد بن علي، أيها الباكر يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا عبد الله يا جعفر بن محمد أيها الصادق يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا موسى بن جعفر أيها القادم يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي بن موسى أيها الراضي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا جعفر يا محمد بن علي أيها التقي والجواد يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي بن محمد أيها الهادي النقي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا محمد يا حسن بن علي أيها الزكي والعسكري يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا وسيء الحسن والخلف الهجة أيها القائم منتظر المهدي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله حاجات. يا ساداتي وموالي إني توجهت بكم أئمتي وودتي ليوم فقري وهاجتي إلى الله وتوسلت بكم إلى الله واستشفعت بكم إلى الله فاشفعوني عند الله واستنقذوني من ذنوبي عند الله فإنكم وسيلتي إلى الله وبحبكم وبقربكم أرجو نجاة من الله فكونوا عند الله رجائي يا ساداتي يا أولياء الله صلى الله عليهم أجمعين ولعن الله أعداء الله ظالميهم من الأولين والآخرين آمین رب العالمین.
آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجرا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں یوں حضرت زینب نے کہا پیٹ کے سینہ برباد ہوئی میں. ایک دن تھا کہ چادر میرے سر سے گری تھی سورج بھی نہ نکلا سر ننگے پھراتا ہے مجھے آج کمینہ برباد ہوئی میں. ایک دن تھا کہ اس شیر کی کرتی تھی میں شاہی اور آج تباہی بے غسل پرا مور نبوت کا نگینہ برباد ہوئی میں. آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجرا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں. بائی موئے بیٹے موئے زندہ میں پھنسے ہیں وارث نہیں کوئی عباس نہیں جیت نہیں شاہ مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں. آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجرا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں. قاسم نہیں اکبر نہیں عباس نہیں ہے عابد تو ہے بیمار. یہ کیسا پڑا مجھ پہ محرم کا مہینہ برباد ہوئی میں. آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجرا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں. یوں حضرت زینب نے کہا پیٹ کے سینہ برباد ہوئی میں. محمد و آل محمد صلوات الفاتحہ.
بر محمد و آل محمد صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد و آل محمد وعجل فرجهم. حر آ رہا ہے اکبر سینے اسے لگاؤ. حر آ رہا ہے اکبر سینے اسے لگاؤ. مہمان کو ہمارے مہمان کو ہمارے خیمے میں لے کے آؤ. حر آ رہا ہے اکبر سینے اسے لگاؤ. اور خود یاد ہوگا اس کو پانی تھا اس نے روکا. خوددار وہ بہت ہے شرمندہ ہم سے ہوگا. پیاسے ہیں سارے بچے اس کو نہ یہ بتاؤ. حر آ رہا ہے اکبر سینے اسے لگاؤ. دیکھو وہ چل رہا ہے میدان میں لڑکھڑا کر. گرنے سے پہلے اکبر اس کو سنبھالو جا کر. اے میرے شاہزادے جلدی قدم بڑھاؤ. حر آ رہا ہے اکبر سینے اسے لگاؤ. حر آ رہا ہے اکبر سینے اسے لگاؤ. عباس اپنے دل سے ہر بات صاف کر دو. ماں فاطمہ کے صدقے حر کو معاف کر دو. جا کر علم کے اس کو سائے میں لے کے آؤ. حر آ رہا ہے اکبر سینے اسے لگاؤ. اور بیٹا حسین قیدی کیسے کسی کو دیکھے، میری طرف سے کھولو تم اس کے ہاتھ جا کے. بابا خفا نہیں ہے، جا کر اسے بتاؤ، حر آ رہا ہے اکبر، سینے اسے لگاؤ. اور تم سے بھی پہلے مرنے جائے گا اس کا بیٹا، جی بھر کے دیکھ لے وہ اپنے پسر کا چہرہ. کم وقت رہ گیا ہے، جا کر اسے بتاؤ، حر آ رہا ہے اکبر، سینے اسے لگاؤ. اور جس دم سنی علی کی بیٹی نے یہ صدائیں، آنسو بہا کے اس کو دینے لگی دعائیں. بچوں سے پھر یہ بولی، حر کو گلے لگاؤ، حر آ رہا ہے اکبر، سینے اسے لگاؤ. سجاد کیا بیاں ہو، کہتی تھی بنت زہرا، بھائی کی جاں بچانے ایک اور حبیب آیا. میرا سلام فضا پہنچا کے اس کو آؤ، حر آ رہا ہے اکبر، سینے اسے لگاؤ. حر آ رہا ہے اکبر، سینے اسے لگاؤ، سینے اسے لگاؤ. بر محمد و آل محمد صلوات. اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد. الفاتحہ.
اعوذ باللہ من الشیطان اللعین الرجیم. بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم. الحمد للہ رب العالمین. الحمد للہ الذی ہدانا لہذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه تبارك وتعالى في محكم كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة والإنجيل يأمرهم بالمعروف وينهاهم عن المنكر ويحل لهم الطيبات ويحرم عليهم الخبائث ويضع عنهم إصرهم والأغلال التي كانت عليهم فالذين آمنوا به وعزروه ونصروه واتبعوا النور الذي أنزل معه أولئك هم المفلحون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. While discussing issues that are contemporary and that are being debated in different circles at the present time, one of the issues that we find being discussed is that of slavery and Islam. What does Islam have to say about slavery? When we talk about slavery, generally everyone in the world today would consider slavery to be an evil, to be something repulsive, and you would not find anyone who would speak in favor of slavery. Nobody would say slavery is good. Everyone knows that slavery is evil. In the past couple of years, many books have been written about slavery and even about Islam and slavery. For example, there is a book by Jonathan Brown, there is another by Bernard Freeman, both of whom are professors, both of whom are Muslims, and they have written on the subject of Islam and slavery. We know that slavery has existed in most of human history, and it has been there in one form or another. Arguably, even now, we have slavery in one form or another, and we'll be looking at that. This modern day slavery that we face today is quite different from the slavery of the past, and it takes the form of things like forced labor, colonialism, incarceration, etc. These are modern forms of slavery that we see in the world. So, inshallah, tonight what we want to discuss is what Islam says about slavery. To begin with, obviously, we need to talk a little bit about slavery and the definition of slavery, and then we will move on to see what Islam has to say about the subject of slavery. When you talk about slavery, the very basic definition of slavery is one person owning another. That is slavery. But again, if you're talking about slavery in terms of ownership, what do we mean by ownership? If we define it as owning another person, we find that you can never have full control over other human beings the way you would have over your possessions. So ownership, therefore, is not a very good way of defining slavery. Therefore, we find some people have defined slavery in terms of exploitation. Again, here we have a problem, because if we say slavery is not compensating somebody for their labor, then we find that if somebody is compensated, that person cannot be considered a slave. But this is not true. Again, in history we find, for example, we have individuals like Sokulu Mehmet Pasha, who was a slave and owned by an Ottoman Sultan, but that Ottoman Sultan also paid him handsomely to be his Grand Vizier. So therefore, he was a slave who was paid, so that there is no exploitation. Then how can he be a slave? A slave also who may not receive any payment for his labor, but instead receives food, clothing, and shelter. If a master, and this is something that used to happen in history, if a master provided for the slaves basic necessities like food, clothing, and shelter, then they would be no different from the children of the master. The master's own son, for example, would also do things for his father without getting paid, but he would be a dependent of his father and he would be given all the basic necessities. So again, we find that slavery, if defined as exploitation, would not be completely correct, and that would not be a definition that would work in every case. So if slavery cannot be defined as ownership and it cannot be defined as exploitation, then what can it be defined as? Some people say slavery is simply the opposite of freedom. But again, what is freedom? One scholar put it very nicely when he said, "Man is born in chains, but everywhere he thinks of himself as free." The reality is, human beings are not free of dependence upon others. The Holy Quran puts it beautifully when it says, أَهُمْ يَقْسِمُونَ رَحْمَةَ رَبِّكَ نَحْنُ قَسَمْنَا بَيْنَهُمْ مَعِيشَتَهُمْ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَرَفَعْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ دَرَجَاتٍ لِيَتَّخِذَ بَعْضُهُمْ بَعْضًا سُخْرِيًّا وَرَحْمَةُ رَبِّكَ خَيْرٌ مِمَّا يَجْمَعُونَ. Is it they who dispense the mercy of your Lord? It is we who have dispensed among them their livelihood in the present life and raised some of them above others in rank, so that some may take others into service. And your Lord's mercy is better than what they amass. So from this verse we find the entire system is such that some human beings take service from other human beings. And this is what we find around us. You may be the wealthiest person, but still when you fall ill you need a doctor. When your plumbing goes out you need a plumber, and so on and so forth. There is dependence upon other human beings. So if freedom means that you are completely independent, then there is no such thing as freedom. So therefore we see that it is very difficult to define slavery. Slavery is not a monolith that we can define it in terms in which it would encompass all forms of slavery. Of course, when we talk about slavery today, the first thing that comes to mind is the brutal slavery in America, which some have termed American chattel slavery. This is where human beings were ruthlessly uprooted from their towns and their villages in Africa, taken captive, packed like cattle on a ship, and taken all the way across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they were then sold and auctioned off as slaves to be worked to the bone, and many times until they died as property of the one who bought them. This kind of merciless slavery where human beings were treated as subhuman. This is what comes to mind when we think about slavery today. However, slavery was not always this way, and this is not the only form of slavery. Scholars and historians have shown us that there have been different types of slavery throughout the ages. For example, serfdom. Serfdom was one type of slavery where laborers, mostly peasant farmers, would be free in the sense of owning their own clothes and their tools, as well as the fruits of their labor. However, they were bound to a plot of land or to a landowner. So whenever the landowner had to move, they had to move. Another kind of slavery in history was indentured servitude, which mostly happened when people were unable to repay their debts. So for a specific amount of time, they became the slaves to their creditors. This was quite common in history, and this was the only way they could repay those whom they owed money. They would become their servants and their slaves. The third kind of slavery is forced slavery, like what we just spoke about when it came to the Atlantic slave trade, where people were taken. They were free in their own lands, but they were forcefully taken as slaves, either sold by the chiefs of their villages or just captured and taken as slaves. This kind of forced slavery was the most brutal kind of slavery. And the fourth kind of slavery that some mention is the slavery that came about after war. The prisoners of war, the POWs, were taken as slaves. Examples of this abound. For example, in the 1400s, the Ottoman Empire, the Uthmani Empire, captured people after they were defeated in war, and these prisoners of war were then settled to work on the lands that were owned by the Sultan. And of course, in the Muslim world, many of the slaves were able to regain their freedom through buying off their freedom using mukataba contracts, where a slave could come to the master and say that I wish to become free and I will pay for my freedom. And they would work and earn and slowly pay back the master according to the contract and the amount that has been agreed upon. And once they had paid off their debt to their master, they were free and they were no longer slaves. So we find therefore that slavery was not of only one kind. There were many kinds of slavery, and in some forms of slavery the slaves were even free to own land. For example, the Byzantine imperial slaves could own property, and in the Uthmani kind of slavery, the Ottoman slaves who were on the lands, as we had mentioned, they could possess their own parcels of land, which then they could bequeath to their children for generations to come. So we find therefore that it is not the case that slavery was always of one kind, and so there were many times that we find in history different forms of slavery existed. When we're talking of other forms of slavery, it's interesting to note that slavery didn't always manifest itself as slavery. There were different things in history that came about that were really very similar to slavery, but they were termed using different names. For example, we have colonialism. Colonialism is where we find that the Europeans came to different parts of the world and colonized those lands, taking it by force from the inhabitants of those lands. The history of colonialism is something that is interesting to read about, how in different parts of the world different Europeans went and how they actually took over those lands and how they exploited the natural resources, and in some instances continue to do so even today. There is an interesting quote by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He said, when the white missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, let us pray. We closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. A very interesting quote which shows how many times colonialists came together with missionaries. These missionaries came to teach Christianity to the locals of the land that was being colonized. And in the pretext of teaching Christianity, they were able to grab the land from the locals. Another kind of slavery is the enslaving of the minds, where human beings are not allowed the freedom of thought, where they cannot think critically for themselves, where different kinds of education systems are imposed upon them, where the textbooks and the syllabi are actually imposed on them in order to whitewash the crimes of certain groups and certain nations that had actually committed these crimes. And so history is then whitewashed and presented the way these people want it to be presented. And of course, this is not limited only to primary schools and secondary schools in different parts of the world, but also in academia. There is a kind of gatekeeping and colonialization that is going on. And that is why we have many studies now of how we can decolonize our academia and different fields of study. So it is important, therefore, in order to remain a free thinker, not to be enslaved in your thought processes, because there are many who want to keep people enslaved and to keep their minds enslaved so that they do not think for themselves. You don't have to think for yourself. We will do the thinking for you. This is what they are trying to say, and we reject that notion. Rather, we say that in Islam we are taught to be free thinkers. We do not need non-Muslims to come and tell us what Islam teaches. We know what Islam teaches, and we will take it from our scholars who are pious individuals, who are God-wary and God-fearing people, and they are the ones whom we can take guidance from. So this is another kind of slavery we find in the modern world. Now, while we are talking of slavery, there is one thing that is important for us to realize, and that is one can also become a slave to his or her own desires. This is a kind of spiritual slavery. It's very important to note that in this kind of slavery, one enslaves himself or herself. So you decide to become a slave of your own desires. And when you become a slave to your desires, then your desires become your master. The Holy Quran describes such individuals when it says, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ أَفَأَنْتَ تَكُونُ عَلَيْهِ وَكِيلًا. Have you seen him who has taken his desire as his God? Is it your duty to watch over such a person? Indeed, there are some people who have become slaves to their desires. There is an anecdote about a very pious individual who was once taken to a king. And when that king saw that in his presence this pious individual was not showing any humility, he was not bowing down the way most of the people would, the king was surprised and asked him, "Why do you not humble yourself in front of me? You are my subject." That pious man replied, "In reality, you are the slave of my slave. Anta abdu abdi. You are the slave of my slave." So the king was surprised and he said, "What do you mean?" The pious man said, "Because you are the slave of your desires and I am the master of my desires. So in reality, you are the slave of my slave. And so why should I show you any humility?" In this way, we find that some people have actually become the slaves of their desires. Though apparently they are free individuals, but they are slaves to their desires. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Now, when it comes to what Islam says about slavery, we find that in Islam, slavery was not restricted to any particular race. As we find in the Atlantic slave trade, for example, where they enslaved Africans. In Islam, slavery was not restricted to any particular race. You would find slaves who were Europeans. You would find slaves who were Africans. Slaves were from different parts of the world. So slavery was not restricted to race. Similarly, Islam did not ever encourage slavery. It found slavery to be an economic and social condition of the times and always deemed it to be something temporary. In fact, Islam encouraged freeing of slaves, and we find even in Islamic law, many times the expiation of certain acts is to free a slave. And so freeing a slave is not only for expiation, but also a good act that is something that is encouraged in Islam. Freeing a slave is something that has been encouraged in Islam as one of the pious actions. In fact, when we look at what scholars have said about slavery, we find that they have all spoken against it. For example, the Egyptian scholar Muhammad Abu Zahra is quoted as having said, Islam would welcome a day when slavery was banned. Jonathan Brown in his work shows that indeed Muslims abolished slavery even before the Westerners and the Europeans did. For example, in the 1780s, before the abolitionist movement in the West, the Muslim Senegalese scholar king Abdul Khan abolished slavery in his realm. Similarly, in 1846, before Lincoln even emancipated the slaves by his proclamation in America, Ahmed Bey in Tunis had already banned slavery. And by the 1900s, Muslims all over the world had agreed that slavery should be banned. So the movement towards the abolishment of slavery in the Muslim world came before such a movement in the Western world. And indeed, the Holy Prophet himself was sent to free human beings. The Quran says, as we mentioned in the verse in the beginning, وَيَضَعُ عَنْهُمْ إِصْرَهُمْ وَالْأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ. He came to free them of their shackles. Of course, here it is interpreted as a kind of spiritual freedom, a freedom of mind. He came to remove the shackles of superstition from them and to free them, to make them free human beings. Even the Imams were known for freeing slaves. The fourth Imam, Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam, is known for having bought slaves, trained them and freed them. He freed so many slaves, and in many instances the Imams not only freed slaves but even married slave girls, thereby elevating their status. So we find that the mothers of many of the Imams were themselves slave girls who had been freed by the Imams. In some instances, in fact, we find that after having seen the akhlaq of the Imams and having lived with the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, when slaves were freed, they remained in the service of the Imams. They did not want to part ways with the Imams. So this itself shows that the kind of slavery that we talk about when it comes to Islam, when it comes to the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, it was not the kind of slavery that we have in our minds when we think of slavery and the brutal practices of the Atlantic slave trade, for example. And when it comes to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi himself, it is said that he freed all the slaves he was ever given, because sometimes he was gifted slaves and he freed them all. The Prophet did not keep any slaves himself. And so this is something that we need to bear in mind. And in Islam, some of the greatest individuals we know of were slaves. Bilal al-Habashi was a slave. Salman al-Farsi was a slave at one time. Qambar, the slave of Imam Ali alayhi salam, what a great individual. Fizza was a slave in the house of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. John, that slave who sacrificed his life, he was the slave of Abba Dhar, and then he sacrificed his life for Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. And so some of the greatest individuals we know were slaves at one time or the other. And so in Islam, being a slave is not necessarily equivalent to being somebody who is lower in rank than other people. Furthermore, when we turn to the traditions, we find that there are many ahadith that talk about the importance of freedom. For example, in one hadith we are told, لا تكن عبد غيرك وقد جعلك الله حرا. Imam Ali alayhi salam in Nahjul Balagha, he says, don't become the slave of someone other than yourself when Allah has created you free. Value your freedom. Of course, here there are depths of meaning. The Imam is talking about not only physical freedom, but mental freedom, the freedom to think, and spiritual freedom, the freedom to be a person who obeys Allah and does not enslave himself to his desires. And the sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, is reported to have said, إِنَّ الْحُرَّ حُرٌّ عَلَى جَمِيعِ أَحْوَالِهِ. Indeed, the free person is free at all times, meaning in every instance. He does not allow himself to become a person who is left without a choice, who is enslaved by his circumstances. No, that kind of freedom is what is mentioned in this hadith. And of course, the famous statement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam on the day of Ashura, when he addresses the enemy, he says, إِن لَمْ يَكُنْ لَكُمْ دِينٌ وَكُنْتُمْ لَا تَخَافُونَ الْمَعَادِ فَكُونُوا أَحْرَارًا فِي دُنْيَاكُمْ. If you do not have any religion or you don't fear the hereafter, then at least be free people in this world. Be free. Be free in the sense of being free in your thinking. Don't just follow. Don't just do things without thinking because everyone is doing it, so you are doing it. You have come to fight me. I am the grandson of Rasulullah. Be free thinkers. Think for yourself and realize what you are doing. Now, of course, when we talk about the relationship between Allah and His creation, between Allah and human beings, the relationship is that of a master with his slaves. Allah is our master and we are his slaves. That is why we refer to human beings as ibadullah, the slaves of Allah. Abd in Arabic means slave. We are the slaves of Allah Azza wa Jal. It means we have to submit completely to Allah Azza wa Jal. Complete subservience like that of a slave. The relationship is not what is similar to that which is mentioned in Christianity or Judaism, which consider human beings to be the children of God. We are not the children of God, we are the slaves of God. Therefore, we are to be free in the world in relation to other human beings, but never in relation to Allah Azza wa Jal. In relation to Allah, we are proud to be His slaves. That is the mentality and that is the world view of Islam. We have to be slaves of Allah Azza wa Jal and we have to completely submit to His will. And we find examples of this kind of subservience and complete servitude even between human beings. There is that famous anecdote of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam discussing about the state of his followers, the Shia, with some people who had come from Khurasan. And while they were discussing, these individuals from Khurasan asked Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, Yabna Rasulullah, why don't you rise up? We in Khurasan are all your Shia, we will support you, we will follow you. Rise up and take what is your right, meaning the Khilafah. At that moment, the Imam alayhi salam saw Harun al-Makki. Harun al-Makki was one of the companions of the Imam. He was a young man. He told Harun, enter into the oven, into the tanur. And at that moment, the tanur was hot. A tanur is like an outdoor oven which was used to cook bread. And it was very large. Human being could fit inside it. So Harun, when the Imam commanded him to enter the hot oven, immediately goes inside. And he's sitting in the oven and the Imam continues discussing with the people from Khurasan. After a while, the Imam tells Harun to come out. And Harun comes out, he is unscathed, he is not burnt. and he is completely fine. Then the Imam asks the people from Khurasan, how many do you have like this, who will obey me whatever I command, who will obey my every command without question? When they saw this, they said, Ya Ibn Rasulullah, we don't have even one like this. So the Imam said, that is why I do not rise up. We need followers like this who will listen to us and obey us without question. Then and only then can we rise up. And this is the example of the kind of subservience that is required of human beings. There are many other examples also. There is that famous anecdote of Kadhi Ayav and Sultan Mahmud al-Ghaznawi. We know that Kadhi Ayav, the famous judge, was actually a slave at one time. And Sultan Mahmud al-Ghaznawi was so impressed by him that he freed him, he bought him and freed him. And after freeing him, he made him a vizier and even a qadi in his realm. Now when he became the chief vizier, the grand vizier, those who are closer to the king before the coming of Ayav became jealous. And one day they came to the king and they expressed their displeasure, and they said, how is it that you took this man who was a slave and you freed him and you made him a grand vizier, you gave him a position higher than us while we have served you for years? So Sultan Mahmud al-Ghaznawi says, I will tell you why by demonstrating to you why I chose Ayav to be my grand vizier. Come all of you tomorrow to my palace and I will demonstrate to you why he is the grand vizier. The next day all the ministers of the king went to the palace at the same time, and in front of the king, in the middle of the palace, was a very expensive gemstone. A huge gemstone had been placed there. The king began telling one by one his ministers that I want you to come forward, and they would step forward. He said, now I want you to take this gemstone and smash it. And as each minister stepped forward and he saw that valuable gemstone, which was one of a kind, when the king said, smash it, they were hesitant. They said, oh king, how can I break this very valuable gemstone? It is priceless. And so the king then called Ayav. He said, Ayav, come forward. So Ayav stepped forward. He said, you see this gemstone? I want you to smash it. So he takes the gemstone and immediately throws it to the ground, and it shatters into pieces. So at that moment, all the ministers are surprised and they say, aha, now he has had it. At that moment, the king asks Ayav to explain himself. He says, Ayav, did you not realize that this gemstone is very valuable? Ayav says, yes. Then why did you smash it? He said, because, oh king, your command has greater value in my eyes than this gemstone. Your command is more valuable to me than this gemstone. That is why I smashed it. And so the king turns to all the ministers and says, do you see? This is why I made him my grand vizier and not any of you. And so this is one example. If a human being can be subservient to another human being to this extent, then why can we not be subservient to our Creator, Allah Azza wa Jal, and obey Him in whatever He commands? This is something we need to think about. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Now, seeking freedom is part of the fitrah of every human being. Every human being, and even sometimes animals, have it within their nature to want to seek freedom. They don't like to be enslaved. There is this famous anecdote that you may have heard of that Rumi mentions in his Mathnawi regarding the merchant and his parrot. There was a merchant who had a parrot who would converse with him, and he loved that parrot. He kept that parrot in a cage. And one day that merchant was traveling to Hindustan, which was the land from which that parrot had been brought. So the king said, I am going to your native land. If you have any message that you want me to deliver to your fellow parrots there, please give it to me and I will deliver the message. So the parrot tells the merchant, please tell my brothers that I am here with you and I am in a cage and you converse with me every day and I speak to you. So the merchant says, no problem. And when he travels to Hindustan, he finds in the part of the forest where all the parrots were, and he goes to them and he delivers the message. Upon hearing this message, all the parrots fall down dead. The merchant is shocked. He comes back, and when he travels back, he comes to the parrot and he says, what kind of message did you give me? You gave me a message. When I delivered your message, all the parrots in the forest fell down dead. Upon hearing this, the parrot in the cage himself also fell down dead. The merchant was very sad. He loved this parrot and he loved talking to his parrot. He took the parrot out with the intention of burying it. The moment he placed it on the ground, the parrot sprung back to life and flew away. From this story, we find again that there is this desire in every creature to be free. The parrot wanted to be free. And that is why we find throughout history, slaves have always attempted to gain their freedom. If we look at the late 18th century in Saint-Domingue, which is currently known as Haiti, this was a part of the world that produced 40% of the sugar and half of the coffee that was being consumed in the world at that time. It was a very rich place. They had cotton and chocolate and dyes and so on and so forth. And so we find that in Haiti or in Saint-Domingue in the 18th century, there were many slaves who were brought, and they were worked so hard and so mercilessly that every year 5% of the slaves who were bought would die due to exhaustion and due to being overworked in the farms and in the plantations. However, when the French Revolution occurred in 1789 and the French who were ruling over Haiti at that time, over Saint-Domingue at that time, began quarreling amongst themselves, taking sides, at that moment the slaves got an opportunity and they staged what is known as the most successful slave revolution in history, where they took over their land and drove out the slave owners and regained their freedom. This was known as the most successful slave revolution in history. So we find that human beings are not meant to be slaves. Human beings are meant to be free. Free in their physical life, free in their thinking, and free in spirit, where they are not enslaved to their desires. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Let us now turn to the Masa'ib of Abba Abdullah al-Hussain. Tonight we want to offer our condolences to the sister of Imam al-Hussain, Lady Zainab alayha salam, for her two young princes, Aoun and Muhammad. Who is Zainab? Zainab is that lady who, when asked by Ibn Ziyad, كيف رأيت صنع الله بأهل بيتك? She said, ما رأيت إلا جميلا. When she was asked by Ibn Ziyad, what do you think of what Allah has done to your Ahlul Bayt, your family members? She said, I have not seen from my Lord anything but beauty. This was Zainab Kubra. This was the sister of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. It is said that when Imam Ali alayhi salam gave her hand in marriage to Abdullah ibn Ja'far al-Tayyar, one of the conditions he put was that when my daughter needs to leave with her brother Hussain, you will give her permission, O Abdullah. Abdullah agrees and he marries Zainab alayhi salam. But when the time came for Zainab to leave, Abdullah himself was not well. So he said, O Zainab, take on my behalf my two sons Aoun and Muhammad. They are my representatives with you in Karbala. So Zainab alayha salam takes Aun and Muhammad with her to Karbala. It is said that on the night of Ashura, she is talking to her sons Aun and Muhammad, and she says, tomorrow you have to sacrifice your lives for your uncle Hussain. Make me proud tomorrow, O my sons. And they promised their mother that they would make her proud. But on the day of Ashura, when one by one the members of the Ahlul Bayt were coming to take permission from Abba Abdullah, the Banu Hashim were coming to take permission from Abba Abdullah to go and fight in the battlefield. When Aun and Muhammad came, Imam Hussain turned away from them. But they came and they said, oh, our uncle, give us permission. The Imam was not willing to give them permission to go and fight in the battlefield. They were young boys. And then they came back to their mother Zainab crying, oh mother, our uncle is not ready to give us permission to go and fight in the battlefield. Zainab prepares her two sons with her own hands, and then she holds their hands and comes to Abba Abdullah. Oh my brother Hussain, how is it that you are rejecting my sacrifice? Is it fair that you accept the sacrifice of others but turn away from mine? And Imam Hussain alayhi salam is left with no option but to allow his two nephews Aun and Muhammad to go and fight, but they are so young that he has to teach them. So he calls Abbas, teach them how to fight. Here is Abul Fadl al-Abbas teaching Aun and Muhammad. Oh Aun, this is how you need to strike the enemy. Oh Muhammad, this is how you need to defend yourself from the enemy. And once he had trained them, and then they were raised and made to sit on the horses, and they were sent into the battlefield, these two young princes of Zainab Kubra. It is said that whenever any of the Banu Hashim were going to fight in the battlefield, Zainab alayha salam would stand outside the tent, and she would offer support to the mother or the sister of whoever was going to fight. But when Aun and Muhammad went to fight in the battlefield, she did not stand outside the tent. She was on her prayer mat. And when she heard the final salams from her two sons, at that moment she goes into sajda and she thanks Allah. Oh Allah, accept this sacrifice from me. Ajrukum ala Allah. It is said that Zainab never cried for her two sons Aun and Muhammad. She cried for Hussain, she cried for Abbas, she cried for Ali Akbar, she cried for everyone, but she did not cry for Aun and Muhammad. It is said that once the Ahlul Bayt were released from their prison in Sham, and they were given a place to come and do matam and to cry for the martyrs of Karbala, and that she and all the women came there and they were weeping, and one by one the heads were brought in, and whenever any head was brought in, the mother would come forward and take that head, and the daughter, the sister would come forward and take that head and begin weeping. At the end, however, there were two small heads, but nobody came forward to claim those heads. Somebody asked, is the mother of these two sons, is the mother of these two children not alive? Zainab said, no, I am alive, but I want to cry for my Hussain. Zainab did not cry for her two sons. She neither cried for them in Karbala nor in Sham. But when finally she came back to Medina, when they finally returned to Medina, Abdullah ibn Ja'far says that one day I came home from the masjid and I saw an old lady standing next to my door. I asked her, Ya Amatallah, hal laki min haja? Oh, servant of Allah, do you have any need that I can help you with? She looked at me and said, Oh Abdullah, have you forgotten your Zainab? How could I recognize Zainab when her back was bent and her hair was grey? Now Zainab enters her house, probably when she saw the small beds of Aun and Muhammad, the small prayer mats of Aun and Muhammad. She must have cried out. After all, she was a mother. Wa Auna wa Muhammada. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.
یا حسین یا حسین کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، بھول جائیں گے ہر غم، بھول جائیں گے ہر غم، غم تیرا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کیسے بھول جائیں مقتل حسین کو، کیسے بھول جائیں فاطمہ کے بین کو، باخدا نہ بھولیں گے، باخدا نہ بھولیں گے، غم تیرا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، جس جگہ حسین کا جواں ہوا شہید، جس جگہ ہوا تھا ایک بے زباں شہید، وہ جگہ نہ بھولیں گے، وہ جگہ نہ بھولیں گے، غم تیرا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، السلام کربلا کی خاک، السلام السلام دفن جسم پاک، السلام یہ صدا نہ بھولیں گے، یہ صدا نہ بھولیں گے، غم تیرا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، سرور و ریحان آرزو ہے بس یہی، روضہ حسین پہ ہو سب کی حاضری، یہ دعا نہ بھولیں گے، یہ دعا نہ بھولیں گے، غم تیرا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، کربلا نہ بھولیں گے، یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین، اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد۔
میرے آن محمد، 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 زینب کو دونوں لال بہت یاد آ رہے ہیں، میرے آن محمد، میرے آن محمد، میرے آن محمد، ایک ماں کو نونہال بہت یاد آ رہے ہیں، میرے آن محمد، میرے آن محمد، میرے آن محمد، آئی جو کربلا سے گھر اپنے بھی لوٹ گئے، دیکھا جو اپنے بچوں کا چھوٹا چھوٹا بستر زینب کو دونوں لال زینب کو دونوں لال بہت یاد آ رہے ہیں میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد بے ساختہ ہی ماں کی آنکھوں میں آنسو چلکے زینب نے اپنے بچوں کے کرتے جیسے دیکھے زینب کو دونوں لال زینب کو دونوں لال بہت یاد آ رہے ہیں میرے اولو محمد 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 زینب کے دونوں بیٹے ہے اون اور محمد حیدر کے یہ نواسے ہے اون اور محمد زینب کو دونوں لال زینب کو دونوں لال بہت یاد آ رہے ہیں میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد اس شان سے لڑے گئے زینب کے دونوں بیٹے اسلام پر مرے ہیں زینب کے دونوں بیٹے زینب کو دونوں لال زینب کو دونوں لال بہت یاد آ رہے ہیں میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد ایسا خدا کسی بھی ماں کو نہ دن دکھائے زینب نے جو مصائب دنیا میں جھیلے ہائے زینب کو دونوں لال زینب کو دونوں لال بہت یاد آ رہے ہیں میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد میرے اولو محمد
السلام علیکم یا رسول اللہ السلام علیکم یا امیر المؤمنین السلام علیکم یا فاطمة الزہراء سیدتی نساء العالمین السلام علیکم یا حسن المجتبى السلام علیکم یا ابا عبداللہ وعلى الارواح التي حلت بفنائك واناخت برحلك عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء السلام عليك يا أنيس الفقراء السلطان أبا الحسن علي بن موسى الرضا كن شفيعنا وشفيع والدينا في يوم الجزاء ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب العصر والزمان السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان السلام عليك يا إمامنا وإمام الإنس والجان السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.